Hello students. As we all know that role of imports and exports are very important in economic geography. After this discussion, you all will be able to know about India's foreign trade, mainly export and import, direction of India's trade, direction of India's trade with regard to export as well as import, as I mentioned, composition of India's trade export, composition of India's trade import, India's service trade, and then we will also discuss few issues. You are experiencing the effect of international trade if you can stroll into a supermarket and find Costa Rican bananas, Brazilian coffee and bottle of South African wine. International commerce enables countries to extend their market and gain access to commodities and service that might otherwise be unavailable in their own country. The market has become more competitive as a result of international trade. As a result, pricing becomes more competitive and the consumer receives a lower cost product. Import is a business word that refers to the purchase of raw material as well as finished goods from another countries. Export, on the other hand, refers to the sale of goods and services produced in United States to foreign countries. Imports or exports, these are two important parts of any country's economy. Imports assist a country in obtaining goods and services that it does not produce domestically, whereas export assists a country in earning foreign income that allows it to purchase imports. The balance of trade is determined by difference between a country's export and import of commodities and services. In an economy's total export surpasses its total import. It is considered to have a favorable balance of trade. So when we are talking about balance of trade, actually it is a balance between export and import of a country. India's foreign trade was largely determined by the strategic need of the British colonial power prior to its independence in 1947. Like other colonies, India too was a supplier of raw material and agriculture commodities to Britain and other industrial countries. And it used to import the manufactured goods from Britain. The dependence of colonial India on Britain for manufactured goods hindered the process of industrialization and obliterated the indigenous handicraft and cottage industries. As a part of the British strategy, India had to export more than its import prior to World War II. So as to meet the unilateral transfer of payment to Britain by way of the salaries and pensions of British officers, both military and civil dividends on British capital invested in India, and interest on sterling loans. This helped India to achieve a favorable trade balance. In 1946, India was able to build a huge sterling balance of rupees 17.33 billion, even after paying off the sterling debt. However, the share of raw material in India's export declined from 45% in 1938-39 to 31% in 1947-48. Whereas, the share of manufactured goods increased from 30% in 1938-39 to 49% in 1947-48. It was only after independence that India's trade pattern began to change in view of its development needs. India, as a newly independent country, had to import equipment and machinery that could not be manufactured domestically. In order to create new production capacity and build infrastructure known as developmental imports, it also had to import intermediate goods and raw material so as to make full use of its production capacity, known as maintenance import. Moreover, as a new developing country, it had to import consumers' goods such as food grains that were in short supply domestically in order to curb inflationary pressures. Such heavy dependence on imports adversely influences a country's balance of trade. It necessitates the need to expand export to finance its import. Exports have shown an increase of about 20% during the last 4 decades in 4 phases. For example, during 1972 to 77, 87 to 90, 93 to 96 and 2000 to 2004. However, the exports increased remarkably at 30.8% in 2004-05 and thereafter grew at around 23% till 2007-08. A negative growth in exports was witnessed in the last 3 decades in 2001-2 and export declined by 1.6% in 1998-99, by 5.1%, in 1991-92 by 1.5% and in 1985-86 by 9.9%. It is also interesting to note that the growth of India's export has been much lower than that of some of the Southeast Asian economies whose share in the international world trade rapidly increased. Data from the Directorate General of Commercial Intelligence and Statistics, that is known as DGCINS, has been used to carry out the analysis of India's trade data. Trade data in India is also compiled by country's central bank, the Reserve Bank of India. There exists wide divergence in the data compiled by the 2 government agencies. I borrowed this table from DGCINS and RBI data, Economic Survey of 2006 and 7, Government of India. You can see that while the 2 agencies are recording the same transaction, the scope, time period, definition, method and coverage of item of trade differ considerably, besides inclusion and exclusion errors in trade items. While RBI relies on foreign trade exchange release, receipt, return, which are actual cash outgo and cover all flows, DGCINS relies on customs data, which in turn are based on bill of entire import document filed with the customs, which might remain somewhat incomplete for a number of reasons in the short run. Defense imports are not reflected in DGCINS data as such for a particular time period at any specific data, given the leads and lags in reporting the 2 sets of data would never match. As per present revision policy of RBI, data on export and imports are revised every quarter up to 24 months, while DGCINS finalizes their data after 8 months. However, the extent of this level of divergence in the current assumptions make it difficult for calibrating the policy response to external sector development in the short runs. India's total external trade, including goods and services, grew to $433 billion in 2006 and 7. The trade in services has been growing faster than merchandise trade, and the share of services in the total external trade increased from 25.8% in 2004-05 to 27.4% in 2006-07. With a growth of 32% in 2006-07, service trade reached up to $76.2 billion. Service export constituted almost 60% of the merchandise export in 2006 and 7. You may be thinking that I am giving lot of data, but it is pertinent to make you understand through taking examples from these data about the balance of trade. So, the robust growth in export and import during 2006 and 7 is attributed mainly to the favorable global demand conditions, increasing competitiveness of India's manufactured products, firming up of commodity prices and supporting domestic policy measures. In 2005, India was one of the fastest growing exporting countries in the world. Merchandise import also registered a growth of 29% in 2005-06, despite the previous year's robust growth of 43% due to sharp increase in oil import in the wake of the rise in international crude oil prices. India's goods market reflected more openness as its merchandise trade as a percent of GDP increased from about 21% in 2001 to approximately 33% in 2005-06. India's import have grown at a much faster pace than its export, leading to widening of trade deficit. The strong growth of manufacturing and service sector is reflected in its import bill. The share of telecommunication, equipment, office, machines and aircrafts have risen appreciably. Fuel imports remain a major import item, accounting for close to 36.2% of India's total import in 2006 and 7. So, I am giving a yearly temporal data to make you understand India's direction of trade in connection with export and import both. You can also take data of different year, and you can also try to see that how the growth is taking place in connection with export as well as import. Gradually, reliance of India's export on the markets of a few countries has reduced considerably. India's over-dependence on the OECD countries, which accounted for 66.1% of India's export in 1960 to 61, declined to 41.2% in 2006 and 7. As it is shown in the figure also, export to European Union declined from 25.1% in 1987 to 88 to 20.4% in 2006 to 7. Compared to that, in 1960-61, the UK was the largest destination for India's export, with 26.9% share, which declined to 6.55% by 1987-88, and further dropped to 4.39% in 2006-7. So, you can see that how drastically that curve it goes up and then it comes down, and there are different factors which makes this changes in the economy. The decline in US share in India's export was from 16% in 1960-61 to 11.1% in 1980-81. But the increase to 40.9% made US the single largest destination for India's export. India's export to Japan have witnessed considerable fluctuation from 5.5% in 1960 to 61 to 13.3% in 1970 to 71, which dropped down to even 2.23% in 2006-7, and OPEC has emerged as an important export destination for India. From 1.4% share in 1960-61 to 16.4% share in 2006 to 7, India's to Russia. This further reached the all-time low to 0.72% in 2006-7. India's export share to developing countries remarkably increased from approximately 14% in 87-88 to 40% in 2006-7. India's export to SAARC jumps from 2.6% in 1987-88 to close to 4.98% in 2006-7. Besides, its export to China increased remarkably from a negligible 0.1% in 1991 to close to 7% in 2006-7. India's export to Africa also grew rapidly from 1987-88 onwards, and in 2006 and 7 it went very high. Over the year, there also has been a significant change in value terms in the direction of India's imports. India's dependence on OECD countries for imports substantially declined from 78% in 1960-61 to close to 59.8% in 1987-88, which further declined to 36.5% in 2006-7. India's import from European, which accounted for 33.3% in 1987-88, declined to 17.5% in 2006-7. In 60-61, the UK accounted for 19.4% of India's import, which remarkably declined to 8.2% by 1987-88 and came down to a percentage which was mere 2.19% by 2006-7. Moreover, the share of India's import from North America also declined significantly from 31% in 1960-61 to 10.3% by 1987-88, which further reduced to 7.4% in 2006-7. Mainly because of substantial decline in the share of import from US from 29.2% in 1960-61 to 6.61% in 2006-7. The US still remains the single largest exporting country to India. The increase in the share of OPEC in India's import jumped from approximately 4.5% in 1960-61 to its peak that went up to 27.8% in 1980-81 due to the rise in India's oil bill. However, this subsequently declined to 5%, approximately 5% in 2000 to 2001, but remarkably grew later and it reached close to 29% in 2006-7, primarily because of the rise in oil prices. So, India's import from developing countries also grew remarkably. We can say that it started from 17% and it went up to 31%. In the same way, the share of Asia's in India's import steeply rose from approximately 12% in 87-88 to close to 25% in 2006-7. And it was mainly because of increased import from other developing countries, especially China, whose share in India's imports jumped from 0.7% in 87-88 to 9.13% in 2006-7. So, the share of India's import from Africa also increased, that which was close to 2.9% in 87-88 and that went up to 3.57% in 2006-7. The share of other countries, which was almost negligible until 1999-2000, that jumped to 31% in 2001-2, which reveals increased diversification in India's imports. Over the last 5 decades, the composition of India's export has become more broad-based with visibly decreased dependency on any product category. Moreover, a remarkable shift in India's export from agriculture product to manufactured goods had been a positive move. The share of manufactured goods in India's export steadily rose from 45.3% in 1960-61 to 80.7% in 1999-2000. However, it subsequently started declining steadily and reached to about 68.6% in 2006-7. Among the manufactured goods, gems and jewelries, which accounted a very low percentage, also increased. Compared to gems and jewelry, the share of ready-made garments also grew remarkably, mainly due to the higher international prices and the increase in domestic refining capacity. The export of agriculture and allied products that comprised a significant 44.2% share in 60-61 also declined to 31.7% in 70-71. Thereafter became insignificant in India's export basket. The composition of export of manufactured goods in India in 2006 and 7 mainly consisted of gems and jewelry, ready-made garments, machine and instruments, pharmaceutical and fine chemicals, manufacture of metals, transport equipment, primary and semi-finished iron and steel, cotton yarn, fabrics, electronic goods, leather and manufacturer, handicraft, leather footwear and others. India's export of agriculture and allied products include marine products such as raw cotton, oil meal, fruits and vegetables, spices, coffee, tea, unmanufactured tobacco and others. India's import primarily consists of petroleum products, fertilizer, capital goods, edible oil, etc., wherein there is a little flexible to reduce its import bill. However, the imports witnessed a significant shift since independence. There had been a significant growth in India's import of petroleum product due to overall economic growth in the country, that rise in petroleum prices and limited indigenous exploration and refinings. The fertilizer industry also grew, and it increased significantly after 1960-61. The share of cereal imports came down in India in 1960 to 61, that was close to 0.8%. India became a net exporter of food grains, a fact that highlights the success story of the Green Revolution in India. However, the growing demands due to rising population pressure and the vagaries of rain keep creating the need to import food grains from time to time. Due to greater rise in the demand for oil as compared to production, India's dependency on edible oil increased remarkably as reflected by their import growth. Compared to that, India evolves its own capacity for manufacturing capital goods. Its import share of capital goods declined substantially in 1960 to 61, and thereafter it increased little bit. The other product categories in India imports that constitute can be categorized as electronic goods, gold and silver, chemical, pearl, precious stones, iron and steel, non-ferrous metals, professional instrument, optical goods, computer software and others. Export and imports are the vital part of trade in any country. India's import and export has grown significantly post 1991, and it is increasing day by day. However, still we are facing the crisis of trade deficit, and it is necessary to reduce this trade deficit to develop the country. As a student of economic geography, you should understand all the different aspects of balance of trade, composition of trade, the current status of export and import in India.